But I actually think people need to take themselves off the hook, thinking that they should be able to resist all these foods that surround them on a daily basis. Because we don't have to be so good at willpower if we're smart enough to fill our food environment with good, tasty, satisfying, brain healthy foods.
I'm Dr. Drew Ramsey, and it's just an absolute treat to be with you again to talk about all things that we are all going to do in our everyday lives to take care of and improve our mental health. Now, I have a very special guest with me, a good personal friend and a fellow brain foodie, Dr. Annie Fenn. Annie and I are friends. We're both residents of Jackson, Wyoming, and as I've transitioned to living out west, Annie's been just a dear friend and really helped me and guided me to settling here. I think the very first big mountain bike ride I went on was with Annie and her husband early in the first summer I was living here. And then Annie's a OBGYN physician who practiced here. So so many of the people that I meet, they know Dr. Fenn. They either have been delivered by her or know someone who has. And one of the really special parts about our relationship has been hearing about Annie's book and this book, The Brain Health Kitchen. And we're going to hear all about her development of this platform and this book. But I heard about this book really, really early when it was just an idea, just as we met, 5 or 6 years ago. And it's such a treat for me to meet people who are in the mental health and brain health and medical and culinary space, and to see a dream like a book become realized, and especially for it to be as beautiful as this. This has really become my go-to favorite brain health cookbook. It's just so gorgeous. It has a whole chapter on olives. How can you not love that? And so, Annie, it's really a treat to be with you and to get to do a little bit of a deep dive on all things mental health, brain health, and food.
Thanks, Drew. I'm absolutely delighted to be here.
Well, first, thank you. Let's just get right into it. Can you share with everybody, because I know a bit about your history, but a little bit about you. You, for a long time, were a traditional OBGYN doc delivering babies, but in a very special place here. There's often a lot of snow in between you and women who are in labor. Can you tell us a little bit about your history as a physician?
It's true. So my path as a physician is a little bit different than some. I trained in Chicago, big city hospital, did my residency, went to medical school there, trained at Cook County Hospital, delivered my first baby at Cook County. And, when I was looking at opportunities after residency, my husband and I were looking in the greater Chicago area, as one would. And then we got this idea that we didn't want to just travel to the mountains maybe once a year to go on vacation, that we actually just wanted to live in the mountains. And if we were going to do that, maybe we should do that, now when we were young rather than later when we're retired. So that's what we did. Everyone basically thought we were completely crazy, going through like a very young midlife crisis, like around the age of 30. But we moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming back in 1994, and I set up my own practice. I was solo for the first 7 years practicing OBGYN, which I do not recommend to any physicians out there, physicians in training.
And just for the non-physicians listening, that means that you pretty much are on 24/7 call.
I was on 24/7 call. I had a family practice doctor who could deliver babies to back me up, but for high risk, it was me. So I actually loved it. I loved being always there for my patients. I loved knowing all of my patients and following them, from infertility to, getting pregnant, throughout the pregnancy, postpartum. I just liked the whole journey. It was exhausting, but I loved it. And so I practiced OBGYN here for 20 years. And no, I never had to snowmobile in to deliver a baby, but it's been close. It's been very close.
Well, you then made I would say a transition. You got around culinary medicine. You retired from clinical practice. And can you tell a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, so I was 20 years into my practice. I wasn't solo forever, thankfully. I had brought in partners. My best friend from medical school and residency joined me. And then we had 3 other doctors join us. So when I left the practice that I built, there were 5 doctors, 3 of them delivering babies. And as you know, this is a small community. There were plenty of doctors, plenty of providers. And what was going on with me was I was just getting a little bit itchy to use a different part of my brain. when you've been doing one thing for a long time and doing it very, very intensely, it becomes, not easy, but it's not as challenging as it once was. And I was feeling like I needed to just work outside of the box somehow. A big dream of mine has always been to go to culinary school. I grew up as a cook. I cooked all through high school. I cooked all through medical school. I've always been someone who writes down recipes and shares them with people. I even had a blog called Jackson Whole Foodie back when I was practicing medicine, where I would write about local food producers and I would put recipes on there. And it's still up if you want to go check it out. So I had this in my system, right? So I decided to retire. I decided to give up my clinical practice and get some culinary training. So I went to medical school, or I went to culinary school. I went to culinary school in Italy, in central Mexico, in a very food-oriented place near Oaxaca called Tepoztlan. I went to the Culinary Institute of America for a short stint. And I didn't know what I was going to do with this. I think my story is one of someone who has a passion. And if you listen to that passion and you follow it, and you're fortunate enough to be able to do so like I was, then it takes you places. I didn't know where I was going to go with this, but I ended up teaching cooking classes back here in Jackson Hole. But this time I wanted to teach people how to eat better. I felt like the root cause of a lot of the illnesses that I was taking care of, even as an OBGYN, even like the surgeries I did, the preterm labor complications, all those things, I felt like the root cause was poor nutrition and poor lifestyle factors. So I just thought that people should eat better.
Meaning that a lot of even like complex OBGYN clinical situations, as a clinician, you sit and think, there could have been some prevention, not that, it's all patients' faults, but if we would have managed this, thought about this, made a different plan and a strategy 5 years ago, 3 years ago, we'd be in a different clinical situation right now.
It's true. And now there's so much data and science focused on women's health, which is wonderful. Back then, I was sort of practicing OBGYN with one hand behind my back because there were no nutrition studies. Now we know you can treat polycystic ovary disease with a dietary pattern. We know that if you give omega-3 fatty acids to a pregnant woman, they're less likely to have pregnancy complication like early ruptured membranes. So we know these things now. And back then, I just had a hunch that that's what was going on.
I'm really glad to hear you say that also, because I think so often people think about culinary medicine or the food as medicine movement is really just for, maybe the worried well, and that there isn't as much science or something really serious that so many women struggle with, like polycystic ovary disease, that there are things in your daily life that you can do to, improve the situation and maybe for some people really, have significant reversal. Annie, I don't want to derail us, but I've got to ask this question. I think everybody listening is probably curious, because we all face these moments in our life. There's something inside of us. Maybe we know it. It's a passion, like you knew you were writing, you were cooking, right? You already knew that. But there's something inside of us that even that we're doing something that makes sense and we're good at and people are impressed with, and we've got to make a change. And I see people so often on my couch, they're really struggling, whether it's their marriage or their profession or their college major, but particularly for people who are mid-career. And I'm wondering if there's something in your journey in the kind of, I want to say the exact moment, but when it shifted from am I, should I might, to I'm going to.
It's such a good question. I used to go on vacation every once in a while to a place called Rancho La Puerta that has a cooking school, and I would go there and attend cooking classes to whoever the presenter was. And right before I made my decision to make the leap and change professions, on the bus, on the way back, I started writing down a meal plan of a cooking class that I wanted to give that was based on healthy food. It was Mediterranean dietary pattern based, which I still write and talk about today. And I wrote out this detailed plan. And as I was thinking about this, I was starting to envision the fact that I could reinvent myself as a culinary instructor. And if I did that, I could maybe do just as much, maybe even more good for my patients and for other people by showing them how to eat better. And I don't know if, thinking about it very concretely helped me. But when I got back from that trip, I told my husband that I wanted to go to culinary school, which is a crazy idea when you're a busy doctor and you're at the peak of your career and you've worked so hard to build a practice and you got lots of patients, wanting to see you and you're doing a lot of surgery. It's an absolutely bonkers idea. But
that's why I wanted to ask about it. It's bonkers, but if without that idea, we wouldn't have this book. Without that idea, a part of you wouldn't have gotten expressed. And I think it's something we all struggle with. Which of these creative ideas, which of our little passions should we really follow? What I like about what you mentioned is that it's not like it came out of nowhere. And I think that's where I see so many people struggle. If you want to be a shepherd and it's a bonkers idea, go spend a couple weeks.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so I wrote that blog. I wrote Jacksonville Foodie, and I didn't think anyone would read it. I was basically writing it to put my thoughts down on paper or on the web and putting it out there. And, you just never know what's going to stick. And I started to think about a career built around food and health. This was even before there were culinary medicine, fellowships, before culinary medicine was even a thing, honestly. This was 2010. And so that was sort of the way I dipped my toe into it. And then when I did make the leap, it wasn't easy. I actually went through a couple years of really feeling like I was missing out from something. I had gotten up every single day in my adult life and gone to a hospital very early in the morning. This is basically what I did for 25, 30 years before I decided to retire. And so, there was a lot of transition that had to be made. I had to have a new routine and I had to create my own routine. So I created it around writing, a writing practice. And as you know, as a writer, you're a fabulous writer. Writing doesn't just get good. Like, people aren't born gifted writers. I guess some people are. But for most of us, it's a lot of hard work. So sitting down and writing every day is sort of how I found my way.
How do you have the discipline to do that? So many people, for a while, I had I'd write Instagram posts every day. But how do you find the recurrent, consistent discipline to make space for that?
It's really difficult. Plus, my kids were still young. They were in middle school. They weren't little, but they were still, very, very busy. I carried around a notebook, and I would always have it in my backpack. So I'd be at soccer games or soccer tournaments, or whenever I had downtime, I would pull out my notebook. I write down different food ideas for recipes, foods I'd had maybe eating out that I thought were good, or things that I could change to make them more healthy. I just kept a running list of things that I was interested in, and I would put it down on paper.
You were having a lot of ideas about culinary medicine, about becoming a culinary instructor, about delicious food, about how to make delicious food. And I think that's something important to note early in this podcast, that of the various folks in the brain food world, Annie's food is just so delicious. And I should be honest, I've probably eaten a little bit more of it than some of the other people. So maybe one of these days you and Uma Naidu will have to throw down and we'll see who really, has but your food. I've not eaten Uma's food, so yes. But your food really stands out, and I mean that very sincerely as an eater and as somebody who really loves food. You're really fun to cook with. Part of my actually coming here was Annie and I put on the town of Jackson invited me to give a lecture and then to put on a cooking class with Annie, and we went to a very lovely house, lovely kitchen. But what was really just mind-blowing was how organized and seamless the course went. There were 16 or 20 people there, none of whom had culinary training. And this whole crew cooked up a gourmet feast, and it just tasted so good. And so before we get too far into your transition to culinary medicine, I just wanted to hear a couple of tips in terms of what are some of the things that you do that helps make food taste extra delicious.
Oh, well, that is all so kind of you to say. I honestly think it comes from, I come to this place with a love of food, with a love of sitting down at the table and sharing food. Maybe it's my upbringing. I grew up in a Sicilian American family. Food was at the center of everything. We're the kind of family that would be eating lunch, talking about what we're going to have for dinner. Sunday suppers were a real event at my house. And I lived close to my grandparents who didn't even speak English, but I could hang out in the kitchen and I could enjoy the love that they would give me through the food that they would be making, like homemade minestrone soup every day. And, they would make homemade pasta. My grandmother made her own cannolis. And so I grew up around this food being very important, being very instrumental, being this glue that holds families together, the enjoyment of enjoying other people around a table. And when I left medicine, I think that I wanted this to be my overriding theme. I want people to enjoy their food. I want people to love what they're eating. I don't want people to think about healthy food the way it has been thought of in the past. It's like boring or bland or something you don't crave or something that's not like super exciting. So I set out, when I started looking at food through the lens of brain health, to create recipes that would just sort of bring that spirit of generosity, of abundance. The foods, of course, are very good for you because I include all neuroprotective foods, and I'm omitting some of the foods that I grew up with that were not so good for the brain that we know now. But I'm keeping the joy and I'm keeping the enthusiasm in it. And I think, how some meals are delicious, but they're not over the top unless the person that serves it to you is incredibly enthusiastic about it. You can just feel the love and the joy that goes into that. I think that makes a difference for everyone who cooks.
I was just thinking about your minestrone soup from your grandparents and the way that a food prepared like that is such an expression of love. And there's something about an Italian grandparent making you minestrone that has an intention and a feeling to it that it seems a little hard to find these days. Not that those of us who are feeding kids and grandkids don't do it with a lot of love. There's something very old world about that. It doesn't need to be proven. They don't need to like Instagram it or list the nutrients or why it's so great for this or that. Right? They just made it for you, and you knew. Something like so simple.
I think it speaks to the concept of fit. So while I was writing the book, I come up with this idea, like, what if someone came to me who knew nothing about brain healthy eating, and they wanted me to describe what is a brain food? What makes something a brain food? So I came up with the 4 F's, which we can talk about. But one of the 4 F's is fit. And fit for me is my grandmother saying, this is how we eat. This is who we are. You belong here. And this minestrone soup is part of that. And I just sort of internalized that through my entire adult life. Fit means that this food makes sense to you. In your book, one of my favorite parts of your book is talking about your food roots. I think it's at the end of your book, Eat to Beat Anxiety and Depression. You talk about food roots. So this is what I'm talking about.
So the most recent book, Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, thank you for mentioning it. And if folks aren't aware, it has a 6-week plan at the end. And it goes through 5 weeks of different food categories, one each week. But the last week is your food roots. And the idea behind that is really captured in your story of minestrone soup, because it felt like medicine had brought me to nutrition minimally and really through the lens of nutritionism, right? B12 is good, omega-3s are good. And in that thinking, like, some things are bad, cholesterol, saturated fat, right? And this idea of food having much deeper meaning, especially as a psychiatrist, to listen to that fuller story. And your story about minestrone soup captures it, right? That when you sit and have minestrone soup, it has a neurobiological meaning to you beyond those nutrients, right? It has an orientation of the self. You are a Sicilian American woman who comes from a culinary tradition. And I think the more that we can work to accentuate and excavate that in our lives, because many of us didn't have that, I'll call it like really wonderful and concrete example, like as perfect as it gets, the Italian grandma, like you actually had one. But a lot of people I find, they've been displaced. Their parents immigrated and they didn't learn any of the traditional foods because they were ashamed of them. Or individuals who just didn't really grow up with a lot of food culture. Parents were really busy, a lot of processed food, a lot of fast food. And so kind of exploring that is one of those pieces. Thank you for highlighting that. I just think it's such an important part.
Yeah, and my nuclear family was, as you're saying, I grew up on processed food. I grew up on frozen dinners. My mom and dad were not interested in, keeping these cultures alive. They were interested in convenience. with 4 kids running around all a year apart. I don't say that I can blame them too much, but, with my grandparents, it's pretty much where those traditions stopped if I hadn't been paying attention. So I think that people do need to dig into their roots. You might have to go back a couple generations. And also, I think it's important to know that like the Mediterranean diet has been studied, extensively for its heart and brain health benefits. We know that following a Mediterranean dietary pattern prevents heart disease, prevents Alzheimer's disease, other types of dementia. But that doesn't mean that you have to eat like a white person from the Mediterranean. This is not what that means, because there are other traditional diets like the Asian American heritage diet, the African American heritage diet, the Latin American heritage diet. If you look at these food pyramids, they look very much like the Mediterranean diet. They're primarily plant-based. There's some fish. There's small amounts of dairy. And if they were to be studied, they probably would have the same proven health benefits as a Mediterranean diet.
I think it's just such a great point, because we hear the Mediterranean diet all the time. That means like Italian or Greek food. But, there is that kind of, you see that bias that we're not talking about Moroccan food, which is sitting right there on the Mediterranean. And so it's a really great point. And the data really, certainly in terms of depression, supports traditional foods in all of those diets, and that being a healthier choice than processed foods. And in some ways, it's a reasonably simple thing to say. I think it's very hard and complex to do for a lot of households. Eddie, can we talk a little bit about just research? Cognitive health has really been your focus in terms of your culinary medicine world, and you focus on brain health specifically. And there is a shift in your world, because at this point we're up in your story, in the point in your story where you're thinking about this, but you notice some changes in a loved one, and it really crystallizes a focus for you about food and health.
Right. So, between 2010 and 2014, I was jotting in my journals. I was writing my blog. I was creating recipes. I was teaching classes at the Elks Lodge, the one downtown. That's what I was teaching there. I was collaborating with our hospital to do healthy cooking programs for diabetes, for dementia prevention. So I was already in this space, moving back towards the hospital. And that's when my mother got diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, which can sometimes be an early stage of Alzheimer's. And in her case, that is what it turned out to be. So when my mom was diagnosed with MCI, mild cognitive impairment, I started to take an even deeper dive into what does the literature say about a healthy diet slowing down the progression of early dementia. It's a very simple question. And back in 2015, there were papers out already showing that a Mediterranean-style dietary pattern could actually slow the progression of someone who has early dementia. It may even prevent it in someone who doesn't have it. So I basically did a deep dive into all the literature on PubMed that pertaining to this, and I came up with a meal plan for my mom. And my brother moved in with her, and he's a good cook, and he started cooking this way. We basically put her on the MIND diet. This is when the MIND diet study came out of Rush in 2015, and it highlights 10 brain healthy food groups, and it also calls out 5 brain harming food groups that you should limit or avoid. And so we did measures to change her diet towards that, and she's still eating that way to this day, honestly.
Can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the shifts that you made? What are some of the things that you noted in terms of, how she was eating and kind of, I would call it like the low hanging fruit of like, well, right away we're going to switch these things up, and both what those are and how she responded to them?
Sure. So one of the first things that we noticed every time I would go home, I don't live where she lives. She lives in San Diego. Every time I went home to visit, I would open up her refrigerator. And it sort of became this barometer of how she was doing cognitively. Of course, we had suspected that she was having some cognitive issues, but her husband of many years had just died. And so we thought there might be some depression in there as well. So we were trying to figure out, what was going on with mom. But every time I opened up her refrigerator, I would see a deterioration in the types of foods there. She she wasn't always loving to cook like my grandma, but she would cook fresh food all the time. So I would find, say, canned soup, that was half open with a spoon in it, for example. I would find food that was past its prime, like fish that, had gone off and she didn't notice it. There was a lot of diet soda in her refrigerator. She seemed to have be increasing her intake of Diet Coke specifically. And believe me, that was one of the hardest things for us to get her off, was the Diet Coke. It's extremely difficult. And to this day, she still asks for a Diet Coke every day at about 4:00 in the afternoon. This is 8 years later. I also went through her pantry, and this is what I recommend my students do when they're starting to embark on a brain healthy diet, is go through your pantry and identify what's ultra processed, what's processed, what has too much added sugar, what has unhealthy oils, what has the brain harming fats, which is what are the junky processed foods.
Yeah, help us understand that difference between an ultra processed food and a processed food and a whole food.
Oh, it's such a good question. And there's actually a criteria called the NOVA classification out of Brazil. So we all know that ultra-processed food is bad for us, right? There's been a lot of papers coming out, and it's bad. That the studies are absolutely correct. But ultra-processed foods basically are at one end of the spectrum of food where they don't identify with anything that is a whole food, say like a pistachio or a peanut or, a piece of rice, or, avocado. None of those things are identifiable anymore. And what has been replaced by is all artificial ingredients with scientific sounding names and factory created oils and things like that. So these are the worst foods for the brain, are the man-made oils, like the trans fats that have been pretty much, we're starting to get rid of those in our food system. But there are a lot of also processed oils that, they're basically, not the best thing for your brain. So, and then a lot of them have added sugar too, because without the flavor of the whole foods, you have to put in flavor somehow. So they use artificial flavors, they use added sugar, they use fat, to make it just, taste good, basically. So that's ultra processed food. And then there's processed food and minimally processed food. So I use minimally processed foods a lot in my cooking and in my teaching, because not everyone can cook everything from scratch. And I think they're really a boon for people trying to eat healthfully. So an example would be marinara sauce in a jar. That's a good brand that doesn't have too much sodium, it doesn't have too much sugar, and doesn't have artificial ingredients.
You say that, and so this is a tomato sauce, processed food, as you point out. Take it out, look in the ingredients. I should see tomatoes, maybe some spices,
olive oil, basil, probably some salt, and that's okay. You can look at the sodium, amount if you're watching that. Another example would be canned beans. I love cooking beans from scratch, and I have a whole chapter in my book about cooking beans and all different ways to do it. But I use canned beans just as much as I use freshly cooked ones. You can open up a can of black beans. Some brands are better than others. You can tell that by looking at the label and just paying attention to it. So these minimally processed foods are actually, the way that you can eat brain healthfully, well, not having to put like so much time into it. Not everybody has time to cook from scratch. And a lot of people are raising families. I know exactly what those like to work full time and come home at 6 or 7 at night with all these hungry people looking at you and asking you what's for dinner. So in my book, I have some recipes that actually require you to take a bag of frozen butternut squash out of the freezer, open up a can of beans,
so I'm just looking at some of these great visuals and recipes. This is a shrimp on a salad with some grape tomatoes. Just an easy recipe, but maybe a good example where you get some pre-washed organic grape tomatoes. You get some pre-washed organic lettuce. Again, saving time with some of how the food industry has made some moves to actually increase efficiency for us. That can be a great way to access some of this for people.
Yes. And so I feel like, all this talk about ultra-processed food in the media is good because we want to raise awareness that we should not be eating ultra-processed food. 60% of the calories that Americans consume come from this ultra-processed food. that's devoid of nutrition and really brain harming. It erodes at our brain health over time. But I don't want people to hear that word processed and think that they can't get anything from a can or a jar, because then they feel like they don't have time to cook from scratch. And so they're stuck, right?
Mm.
So there is a middle road. There is a middle road, and it's minimally processed food and whole food and fresh food, and combining those things together for easy meals.
So it sounds like one mistake you see people making is when they hear no processed food, they make it so complex because they think they've got to like go pick it almost, like that everything has to be super organic, and that actually there are a lot of tricks and tips in your book and in the grocery store to help you be efficient but still get on a more traditional or whole foods diet. And I wonder if there are a couple of other things that you really see that people miss. You're hanging out with your sons and their friends, and you're seeing something they're doing, and you're like, oh, this is such a big mistake. The way that you're eating right now is really bad for brain health. What are some of the ones that are, how come, like your pet peeves?
I'm really down on takeout these days. And I think everyone got into a habit of getting takeout food during the global pandemic. And I still see it now that, especially in my kids are in their 20s, in that age group, it's really common. It's more common than cooking. It's very common just to go on an app and order food, and it gets delivered in half an hour.
It's not as common as Chipotle, but it's more common than cooking.
Chipotle, you can actually put together a good meal there.
You can. It's one of my moves. I love working with students in college, especially these days, because you beam into the dorm room. You really get a sense of how things are going. But helping college students make their Chipotle order brain healthy is definitely one of my signature moves. And I like it a lot. Because
I love that. I love that.
A lot you can do there. And you can go in, just compare a burrito nutritionally, the wrap, with the corn tortillas they have. Radically different.
Exactly. And also setting up your kitchen in a certain way. My book, in the beginning, I talk about brain health begins in the kitchen and how to set up your pantry, just like I was talking about with my mother, going through and getting rid of all these junky processed foods that's just really eroding at your brain health, and then replacing them with other things that make foods delicious. Like my son is 22 and he's setting up his kitchen for the first time after college, and he is really into spicy food. So we have curry paste, we have miso paste. He likes little fish, so we have canned anchovies and sardines. We have all these like flavor bombs, and
I think every parent listening whose kid is a picky eater is like wondering how you did this, because that sounds like a dream. But I think so many of us.
I think that you will get there. I know your kids are younger than mine. You will get there. But having things that are flavorful, condiments, even good mustard, like, how seeds are so good for brain health because they have all these, monounsaturated fats and omega-3 fatty acids, and, they're packed with selenium, and, seeds are just great. So really good mustard that still has the seeds in it. Things like that can really improve your cooking and improve your overall dietary health.
So it sounds like most makes you seeing people relying too much on takeout, not differentiating between some minimally processed foods, which are helpful, not stocking great condiments. Not that it has to be the most expensive, but there's a difference between a whole grain mustard or having really good curry paste, and making sure that you have those flavor profiles accessible. What are a couple of the things you see people not getting right, especially when it makes a difference? Because part of what I've understood, it seems your field has really pushed us that 40s, 50s, like we want to get this stuff started. Like, let's not be waiting until our 60s, 70s, and 80s to think about taking care of our cognitive health.
Well, the biggest problem I see in people at midlife, starting in their late 30s, early 40s, 50s, is when they start to think about their brain health, they focus on their family history, which would seem really logical, that if your parent has Alzheimer's, you had a grandparent with Alzheimer's, you would be at higher risk. But it's actually a much smaller part of the whole disease process than your lifestyle choices. And so, there's majors and there's minors when it comes to risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And the major factors that you can have a huge impact with is nutrition, especially brain healthy nutrition, and exercise. These are things people should be focusing on, not, worrying because they had a second aunt who had Alzheimer's, or taking a lot of supplements because they heard that it's good to prevent Alzheimer's, or doing a lot of like brain training games on the computer because they read that would keep them from getting Alzheimer's. And these things are, important, and they're all studies on all of these things, and we're starting to put together, how they fit in the overall picture of Alzheimer's prevention. But nutrition and exercise are the top two. And I really wish people would focus on that.
And really focus on, is there something specific, because it feels the public has gotten the kind of eat better, exercise more message for a bit. And I wonder if there's a modification in the motivation for people that you work with in terms of how you add in that cognitive health piece. How can we kind of help our motivation a little bit? Because I struggle with it too. I'm looking right out at probably one of the most beautiful jogs in America, down the elk refuge. Sometimes you're literally like running in the middle of an elk herd of like thousands of elk. It's ridiculous. But I find a little hard time getting out to get there. And I'm just wondering how you kind of use the cognitive health piece for a little extra motivation.
It's an excellent question. The entire time I was working as an OBGYN doctor, I talked to all of my patients about healthy lifestyle, exercise, nutrition, all of these things. I felt like most of the time it went in one ear and out the other. But when I started talking to people about brain health, people started paying attention. And I think the reason is that people are very concerned about getting dementia. And they should be, because it's, the rates are escalating. The population is aging. We're all at heightened risk, and it's not getting any better. The curves are going off the charts. But I think that the hook, at least for the people that I am trying to reach, is that they know that brain health is important. They just don't know how to start. So I say start with a brain health mindset. The brain health mindset is the why. Why do you want to age with a healthy brain? What do you want your life to be like when you're in your 80s, 90s, maybe even older, or even let's just say your 70s? What do you want your life to be like? Do you want to be an active, cool grandma who's taking their kids on some, trip to Africa to look at animals? Like, is that the kind of grandma you want to be? Do you want to be riddled with chronic diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease, dementia, that or take up all of your time and soak up all of your resources? Do you want to have a second career after your first or second one? People are living longer. Women are living longer. Women are living, so much longer after the age of natural menopause than they ever did before. And so I think the first step is think about, what do you want your life to be like? Why do you want to take care of your brain? And once you identify your why, like my why is my potential grandchildren. Okay. Neither of my kids are even married, right? But my why is someday I'll probably have grandchildren, God willing. And I want to be that cool grandma. I want to be active. I also want to continue to make a difference in the world. And so I think you have to dig deep to think about that. And then it becomes really easy. Then you educate yourself about, this is a brain healthy food. This is definitely not a brain healthy food. This one's somewhere in the middle. Maybe it's a treat. Maybe this is something I just eat, over the holidays. And you start to put together your own brain health pattern.
What do you think? I feel we hear so often, though, that some people know, and they find themselves stuck in a pattern where they keep making bad choices. I know ice cream is not the best thing for me. It's summer. I have kids who are young, and it's just hard for me not to almost nightly want to just go get an ice cream cone with everybody. Even though I know that's not the best, probably not the best cognitive health long-term choice. And so I'm wondering how you kind of help people navigate that conflict.
Well, I think that one of the things that everyone should think about is their food environment. We put way too much on willpower. We expect ourselves to be able to resist ice cream that's just a few feet away in the freezer. Ice cream is delicious. Ice cream is amazing. And ice cream is something that, if you think about it, then you want to eat it, right? And so I used to eat a lot of ice cream, let me tell you. The only way I can get around things like ice cream and potato chips and these other hyper palatable foods that are just really satisfying is I can't have them in the house. So part of setting up your own brain health kitchen and having a brain healthy pantry in a food environment is making sure that the brain healthy choice is always the easiest choice. So my snack cupboard, for example, has completely changed since when my kids were younger. It used to be, front and center, you open up the cupboard and you can guess what was in there, right? There were power bars that had a lot of added sugar. There were chips. There were, potato chips. There were nuts that were highly salted and roasted. They're probably, we know, are not that great for us. There's candy even. There's chocolate.
You did a brain health makeover to your snack cabinet.
I did this when my kids were in high school. And I replaced it with things that I knew they liked that were also brain healthy. They like nuts. So we switched out to nuts that they like cashews and almonds and peanuts, which are very good for you. Very good. The brain health recommendations are a quarter cup of nuts 4 to 5 times a week. It's part of a brain healthy diet. So nuts are great. Seeds are great. One of my kids likes pumpkin seeds. Another one likes sunflower seeds. So I have those readily available. Whole grain crackers are not so bad. You have to look at the label, but Triscuits are actually pretty decent crackers. So we have a lot of Triscuits at our house. Peanut butter, nut butter, like almond butter, cashew butter. I have those front and center. Whole grain bread. So anyone can make, some toast with some almond butter, sprinkle some seeds on it. It's very satiating. It's going to last a lot longer than, that junky power bar that I used to buy. And, this is how kids grow up knowing how to eat well, this is how they eat when they're in high school.
It's a really great point also with that idea that you took us to earlier of taking an ultra processed food, like some sort of power bar or snack mix or something that, you're taking something that is healthy, like a nut, and then, roasting it and adding lots of salt and it's in some ways decreasing the nutrient value. And I think you make a great point that minimal process, right? If you're a kid with teens and they're in the habit of making themselves an almond butter sandwich and putting some raspberries on there or sprinkling some pumpkin seeds on there, that really helps them launch and have kind of food competence and food independence with a few basic foods. And I think sometimes I feel like the peanut butter sandwich guilt, which I've tried to stop because, again, it's a little processed, but it gets the job done.
Oh, no, not at all. It's my husband's primary source of protein, the peanut butter sandwich.
And I think that I find myself often, as a busy doc, right, where I'm racing around and seeing a lot of patients where we call it the peanut butter lollipop in our house. You just put the spoon in and bring out and have a glass of water and kind of take a breath and have a minute, but have a nice big dollop of peanut butter as just
we're not talking about processed, some of the processed peanut butters with added sugar. Because when they make peanut butter, what they do is peanuts are actually legumes that are super brain healthy. They even contain resveratrol, a polyphenol that is a big player in long-term brain health. But when most peanut butter companies make peanut butter, the peanut oil is valuable. That's something they can sell, right, separately. So what they do is they make the peanut butter and they take out the peanut oil and they sell that as a separate food product. And then they add in inferior oils. These could be like rice bran oils. These could be palm oils. These are oils that are high in saturated fats, which we don't want to get too much of in our diet. They're also devoid of nutrients. And so you want to and then they have to add sugar to it because it just doesn't taste good. So I'm all on board with the peanut butter lollipop as long as it's good peanut butter.
Yeah, even a brand that you trust. You see this all the time where you turn over, it looks like it's peanut butter, but it's got palm oil, it's got sugar in it, or it's got corn syrup solid, some version of sugar. So it's funny. I was out with a new friend of the day, and he said, "Oh, we make our own peanut butter. Would you like a jar?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Oh, I just, we eat a lot of peanut butter and we decided when we're just going to start making our own."
Yum.
Yeah, and it was just one of those fun little moments of I just hadn't really thought about that, but
I love that.
a fun thing
But I
to do.
actually think people need to take themselves off the hook, thinking that they should be able to resist all these foods that surround them on a daily basis, because we don't have to be so good at willpower if we're smart enough to fill our food environment with good, tasty, satisfying, brain healthy foods. So, long story short, I don't buy ice cream anymore, much to my husband's dismay. If I want to go out for ice cream, we actually just go out for ice cream, like the old fashioned way. And if I'm traveling, like if I'm in Italy where I do some trips for brain health, I don't hesitate to get gelato because it's part of the culture and I just really, really enjoy it. But I'm not eating gelato every night out of my own freezer because a diet that's high in saturated fat is not the best diet for someone who wants to cultivate long-term brain health. We know that a heart protective diet is relatively low in saturated fat, less than 10%. The brain healthy diet is even lower. It's actually closer to 5% saturated fat, which is not to say that the brain healthy diet is low fat, not at all. It's actually very high in monounsaturated fats, like you get from nuts, seeds, oily fish, olive oil, olives, things like that, avocados. And it's also rich in polyunsaturated fats, like the omega-3s we get from fish and some other sources. So it's not low fat. It's very saturating. We know low-fat diets aren't good for the brain or the heart either, right? But it's low in that saturated fat piece. That's one thing that is important to look at.
Wondering a little bit about that, just in the sense it feels like saturated fats are one of those like hotly debated nutrients, at least for a while, in the nutrition world, right? Are they good for you? Are they bad for you? Should you eat red meat? Should you not? It's often what that boiled down to. And I'm wondering how you kind of, it feels like you thread the needle nicely. That I always remember the amazing kind of grilled cheese sandwich that you made for us last time I was hanging out with you, doing some food work and filming a little bit with you. And it was this incredible mix of ricotta, but it also, there was like a nut cheese in there as well. And so it felt to me like I was getting the best of both worlds because I had some ricotta, I had that cheesy goodness and that, that kind of yummy mouthfeel, but I also got all the benefits of the nuts. And it didn't feel, as you said, like health food.
Right, right. So that's what I call the better for you grilled cheese sandwich. I have a lot of recipes that are kind of nostalgic. Like, you know the feeling when someone makes you a grilled cheese sandwich and then you bite into it and you want it to be a little bit melty, right? Mm-hmm. That's from the cheese. That's from like real cheese. So my better for you grilled cheese sandwich has real cheese in it. It has Gruyere, which is a melty French cheese. Everyone knows like how delicious it is. It's like what you used to make fondue, but just a little bit, like a small amount. The ricotta is made from cashews. So this is basically a mix of a nut-based cheese, which is also delicious, very easy to make. I've got an easy recipe in my book for the lemony cashew ricotta. But if you combine the two, you get the best of both worlds. What you do is you're flipping the fat profile of this sandwich to one that's more brain healthy and more brain friendly. And you're still getting, all of the good stuff.
Is part of what happened in the saturated fat story that the American diet really becomes so predominantly focused on dairy and beef, right? That it isn't sort of how you're seeing it in more traditional diets when you travel to Italy, where they still have lots of cheese, they still have red meat, but it's a lower amount and a lower quantity, so that saturated fat stays in a lower percentage. You're getting a lot of fat in your diet, you're getting a lot of protein, but the percentage of it is lower.
Right, right. So what's happened in America over the last decades is people are eating more meats, eating more dairy products. When you go to a restaurant, you'd be hard pressed to get something that's not smothered with cheese at a lot of places. And the meat portions are huge. All of the portion sizes have been upsized in the US. When you eat in a Mediterranean country like Italy or Greece, they do eat very rich cheeses, but they're artisanally produced. They're not processed cheese. There's a huge difference between processed cheese, like a big bag of shredded cheddar or a jar of Velveeta, or like a jar of queso dip, queso,
right.
versus like a sheep's or a goat milk cheese that was fermented. It's got probiotics in it. It's a good source of protein. and it's not eaten in mass quantities. People might have a small wedge after dinner as dessert, or they might have a small wedge with fruit for breakfast. It's a completely different way of eating cheese. So I don't think cheese is inherently bad for you if you're talking about real cheese in small portions. But the way Americans eat cheese is just all wrong. Everything gets upscaled. I think it's more the processed meats and the processed cheeses that are detrimental to a brain healthy diet. So if you just opt out of processed meat, processed cheese, and you choose, just small portions of good quality cheese, number one, you're going to save a lot of money on your food budget. These things can be really expensive. And you're also going to flip the brain healthy fat profile. You're going to increase the nutrient profile. You're going to get more gut-friendly probiotics. The other thing, too, is like when you're filling up on these high fatty foods, there's not a lot of room on your plate for the core brain healthy food groups like leafy greens, whole grains, vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, berries. These are the core brain health foods. And you honestly just can't eat a lot of those if you have a cheesy, meaty, heavy dish on your plate.
And I want to just pivot a little bit. I think so many people have worries and concerns about their cognitive health and their brain health. You've shared really openly about your mother's struggle with dementia. We've seen a number of celebrities coming forward talking about, having risk factors like an ApoE4 gene. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit of how you personally deal with some of the fears that happen for all of us around getting dementia and losing our cognitive health.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. You could say it's one reason why I wrote the book, huh?
I mean, I'm a psychiatrist, so I can ask you a question about it at least.
So I don't have a ton of anxiety about this, but I do have some because, the journey that my mother's been on in the last 8 years is not something I would wish on anyone. She's actually doing quite well. She still lives at home. I have a brother who lives with her. We're just starting to talk about moving her into a care facility. So she's done quite well, I would say. But whenever I start, this is back in medical school, whenever I'd start to get a little anxious about something, usually it was a knowledge deficit. Okay. It's like this big unknown. And once I could figure out how to master or at least understand what was going on with the science or with whatever it was, I would start to feel better. So me doing that deep dive into brain health literature and nutrition back in 2015, the reason I started the cooking school and did the book and all, part of that was I needed to empower myself to understand what I was dealing with here. And then once I was empowered with this knowledge, I understood that there's really not that much of it that it has to do with family history. Even if you have an ApoE4 mutation, if you have 2 copies of the mutation, then that's a little bit of a different story. But most Alzheimer's disease is not genetically determined. And these risk genes, if you carry them, are pliable, meaning they can be turned off or turned down, like the volume can be turned down based on your lifestyle. So once I learned that a healthy lifestyle, exercise, eating the right foods, having some way to mitigate stress, some sort of system personally to mitigate stress. For me, it's meditation and a lot of walking and being with animals and things like that, and writing and doing good in the world. But you have to have stress mitigation too. If you can figure out what works for you, what is your plan, then you can reduce your risk significantly. You can reduce your risk with a brain healthy diet by as much as half. If you add exercise onto that, studies show that you can reduce the overall risk of getting Alzheimer's by about 60%. We see some studies looking in the 60 to 80% range of risk reduction. And I predict in a couple of years, we'll be saying that we can prevent Alzheimer's by as much as 80% in most people. But you need to know what the things are that you should be doing and then figure out a way, put on your brain health mindset and figure out a way to implement them.
Don't just sit there, do something.
It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing. It's not as easy as it sounds, and it can take a long time. And, sometimes it requires a lot of support. but the support is out there. There's so many organizations. I'm on 5 different nonprofit Alzheimer's boards. There's so many resources and education available now for people who are at risk because of their family history and they don't know what else to do.
And it's such an important tip, is along with doing something, getting educated, but finding a community. I mean, I think for so many of us who've been in this world, I know our meeting and spending some time getting to know each other and collaborating on a number of projects and just supporting one another has been such a special aspect of our relationship. And I think that, I extend that a little bit. I think about you and kind of my personal support group when it comes to my anxieties and fears about my mental health or cognitive health, in terms of a great tip being start building a community. If this is something that you're worried about, it's something that matters to you. You don't have to have a family member with Alzheimer's disease or dementia. If it speaks to you, if you're up at night worrying about your cognitive health, don't suffer in silence, and definitely don't suffer alone. There's a lot of organizations. Check out Dr. Annie Fenn's resources. She has a great website. She has an incredible newsletter, really informative newsletter, great recipes. Everything's up, I think, at the brainhealthkitchen.com. Is that your site, Annie? Am I getting that right?
It's brainhealthkitchen.substack.com. So I created this as our community for all of us who are concerned about this, who want to age with healthy brains, who come to the table with any sort of bag of different risk factors. And it's a way for people to interact with me. They can message me, I can message them right back, and we discuss certain topics. Like this last month, we did a deep dive into dietary protein and exercise and how it helps you age. And most people don't realize this, but as you get older, you actually need more dietary protein because your body doesn't incorporate it so well into muscle. And people that age with more muscle mass, who are fitter and stronger, over 65, they age with healthier brains. They have less dementia. So we've been on a protein kick over on the newsletter, and I've been really enjoying all the input that the community has been given to me.
Well, everyone, this is the book. It's the Brain Health Kitchen. This is the great Dr. Annie Fenn, and what an inspiring talk about your transition from being a traditional doc, putting in 20 years of amazing service here in the small community, delivering babies high in the Tetons in Wyoming, and then following your history and your dream and ideas around cooking and sharing. And it's just been such a treat to know you and to enjoy food with you. And thanks so much for everything that you've shared, everyone. I think what's most important for me about this work and about this podcast is what happens next. There are a lot of podcasts out there. And when we started thinking about this, I really wanted to bring on experts to inspire you. And Annie Fenn has inspired me. I eat more berries. I eat more greens. I try more foods. I get more hopeful about my career and about all of my capacity to learn and grow and change. I get inspired by her discipline and by the strength it takes to go from being in a hospital where everyone's depending on you and calling you to sitting by yourself in the winter in Wyoming and having the discipline to write. And so I hope that you can take this conversation and a little bit of Annie Fenn's energy into your life to inspire you to care for your most important asset, your brain and your brain health, and to do that with delicious foods, and to do that with a set of, I would call, like, special guides and companions. And this book is one of them that really helps me and guides me, that I recommend to my patients, that I'm recommending to you. And so, Dr. Annie Fenn, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast with me and to talk about mental fitness, and in some ways, the longest game in our mental fitness journey. As you said, your inspiration. Can you be a fit and active grandmother? And I love you saying, going on strike, you're going to be climbing the Tetons with those grandbabies of yours. I'm sure of it. I can't wait to see you up there cheering you on. And thank you so much for your help with my family settling here. It's really, that's been very meaningful.
Oh, thanks, Drew. It's been such a treat to be on your podcast. And I love how you're really addressing all different sorts of facets of health and brain health. It's really, really amazing. Happy to be a part of it.
It's great to speak to you, everybody. Thanks for the episode. Please share this. Everybody's thinking about cognitive health. And so let's really look to real experts like Dr. Annie Fenn and help her spread this message. Check out her book, share this podcast. It's going to be up on all the platforms and with people that you care about and brains that you love. And we'll see you soon in the next episode. Thanks so much.